Major Kane Drayton tightened the handcuffs around General Reese Calder's wrists and laughed under his breath. "A man like you does not walk through this gate and claim to command this base," he said. Reese did not resist. He glanced at his watch and understood the readiness inspection had already begun without him. Drayton was still mocking the general's identification card, calling it a forgery, when the ground outside the station began to tremble under the weight of marching boots. 40 soldiers surrounded the building, lowered their weapons to their sides, and waited for a single order from the man standing in handcuffs. Nobody in that room understood yet what was about to unravel. If you want to see the general expose the entire chain of betrayal, stay until the very end. Because the truth waiting behind that door will change everything you believe about power. The gate at the western checkpoint of Fort Harrow sat quiet in the early morning, wrapped in a fog that clung low to the asphalt and blurred the edges of the guardhouse lights. General Reese Calder eased his civilian pickup truck toward the barrier, with the headlights dimmed, a plain gray jacket zipped over most of his uniform, and a leather satchel resting on the passenger seat like something alive that needed watching. He had spent the last several hours at a warehouse 40 miles east, photographing crates that were never supposed to leave military custody, and every mile back to the base had tightened something behind his ribs. He was not a man who enjoyed secrecy. He had built his entire career on the opposite instinct, on being visible, on walking the same gravel his soldiers walked and knowing their names before they knew his rank. But months of quiet auditing had taught him that visibility in this particular base had become a liability for whoever was stealing from it. The heater in the old truck rattled faintly against the morning chill, and Reese kept both hands loose on the wheel, watching the guardhouse lights swell brighter through the mist as the distance closed. Somewhere behind him, the sky had not yet decided whether it wanted to be gray or gold, and the air smelled faintly of diesel and wet gravel, the particular scent he associated with every early morning he had ever spent on a military installation since he was a young lieutenant carrying far less weight on his shoulders. I thought briefly of his father, a warehouse foreman in Ohio who had never worn a uniform himself, but had taught his son that a man's word was worth exactly as much as his willingness to keep it when no one was watching. Reese had carried that lesson through every promotion, through every room where he had been the only person who looked like him, through every quiet moment of being underestimated by men who assumed rank alone would never truly belong to him. He did not know, as the gate drew closer, that the lesson was about to be tested in a way he had not fully anticipated. The scanner at the gate read his identification without hesitation, the little green light blinking exactly the way it was supposed to, confirming command-level access for General Reese Calder, commanding officer of Fort Harrow. Major Kane Drayton, 38 years old and standing duty at the western checkpoint that morning, watched the confirmation appear on his own handheld unit and chose in the space of 2 seconds to ignore it. He stepped in front of the truck with one hand raised and told Reese the scanner was malfunctioning again, that it had been acting up all week, and that he would need to step out of the vehicle for a manual check. Reese complied without protest, because he had learned that men who intend to provoke a reaction rarely know what to do when they receive none instead. Drayton looked at the 2 stars on Reese's shoulder for a long moment, then smiled the way a man smiles when he has already decided what he wants to believe. He asked almost conversationally where a person could buy a uniform like that, as though the fabric itself were the subject in question, rather than the man wearing it. Reese gave his full name, his rank, and his position as commanding officer, speaking each word slowly enough that there could be no claim of confusion later. Drayton told him that Fort Harrow did not answer to anyone who simply pinned stars to his own shoulder and expected the base to bow. A younger military police officer, standing near the guardhouse, glanced at the command roster posted inside the booth, recognized the face immediately, and opened his mouth to say something. But Drayton shot him a look sharp enough to close it again. Reese noticed that Drayton's eyes kept drifting again and again toward the satchel on the passenger seat, rather than toward Reese's face or his identification. A man genuinely uncertain about a stranger looks at the stranger. A man executing an assignment looks at the object he has been sent to retrieve. Reese understood in that instant that this was not confusion, not prejudice wearing the mask of procedure, not even simple cruelty for its own sake, though it was certainly cruelty. This was a plan with a target, and the target was sitting on the passenger seat of his truck. He kept his voice level and asked plainly for the search warrant that would authorize anyone to open that bag. Drayton's jaw tightened at the question, and he barked an order for the satchel to be retrieved without further discussion. When Reese asked again calmly what legal authority permitted a warrantless search of a commanding officer's personal effects, Drayton's hand moved to the handcuffs at his belt instead of answering. The metal was cold when it closed around Reese's wrists, colder still because it happened in full view of soldiers standing post at the gate he had walked through nearly every morning for months. Drayton spun him gently but firmly toward the hood of the truck and announced loud enough for the entire checkpoint to hear that he had just apprehended a man impersonating a general officer. Reese did not pull against the restraints, did not raise his voice, did not offer the outrage that Drayton seemed to be waiting for, like a hungry man waiting for a meal. He simply asked whether the body camera clipped to Drayton's vest had captured the scanner confirming his identification before the arrest began. The question landed with more force than any protest could have, because Drayton understood immediately what it implied, and his face changed in a way that betrayed exactly how much he understood. Drayton ordered the camera turned off, claiming a technical malfunction that nobody in that guardhouse believed. A young officer named Owen Hale hesitated with his hand near his own camera switch, clearly reluctant, and Drayton warned him that failure to comply would be treated as insubordination on record. Drayton continued talking as the cameras died one by one, telling Reese that people unfamiliar with the traditions of Fort Harrow sometimes assumed that wearing the right uniform was enough to walk through any door they pleased. He said it with the practiced ease of a man who had used similar words before on other people in other places and had never once been made to answer for them. Reese asked him quietly whether he was describing military protocol or describing a face. Drayton did not answer that question either. High gave the order to transport the general to the security station and the satchel, instead of being logged into an official evidence locker, was placed in the trunk of Drayton's own vehicle. That single decision, made in anger and in haste, would become the first thread that unraveled everything Drayton believed he was protecting. As the truck pulled away from the gate with Reese seated in the back like a common suspect, he checked the clock mounted above the dashboard and calculated the minutes remaining before 40 soldiers would gather for a readiness inspection that he now had no way of attending. He was not afraid. He was counting. Inside the security station, fluorescent light buzzed overhead in a way that made the corners of the room look flatter than they were, and Drayton refused every request Reese made for a phone call to his chief of staff or to military legal counsel. He sat across a metal table and began filling out an incident report with a pen that scratched too loudly against the paper, writing that the detainee had appeared agitated, had attempted to breach the checkpoint, and had resisted physical restraint. Reese asked to read the report aloud before it was filed, and Drayton told him that a man in custody did not get to dictate what the officers around him were permitted to observe. He set Reese's rank insignia on the table between them and spun the 2 stars slowly with the tip of his pen, remarking that a person who genuinely held real authority would never need to keep reminding everyone around him who he was. Reese answered without raising his voice, saying that a genuine officer also would not need to disable a camera in order to prove himself right. Drayton's expression flickered just slightly, the way a poker player's does when a card lands wrong. He demanded the passcode to Reese's secure military phone and access to the satchel that now sat on a shelf behind him, and Reese refused both requests, explaining that the documents inside were part of a protected investigation and could not legally be surrendered on demand. Drayton's response was immediate and predictable. He accused Reese of attempting to steal classified defense material, a charge with no basis and no evidence, spoken purely to frighten a man who did not frighten easily. The phone on the wall rang before Reese could respond, and Drayton answered it with a deference that told Reese everything about the chain of command operating behind this arrest. Colonel Harlan Quill's voice came through loud enough to be partly audible, even from across the table, instructing Drayton to hold the detainee until Brigadier General Sterling Crow arrived to take over the situation personally. Reese heard the name Crow and felt something settle into place, quiet and heavy, confirming a suspicion he had carried for weeks but had never been able to prove. The base's own deputy commander was not merely aware of what was happening, he was orchestrating it. Drayton, misreading Reese's silence as fear rather than calculation, leaned forward and offered what he clearly believed was a generous compromise. If Reese would sign a statement admitting he had entered a restricted area by mistake and voluntarily hand over the satchel, Drayton promised the handcuffs would come off and he would be allowed to walk away without further complications. Reese looked at the paper, then at Drayton, and declined without a trace of hesitation in his voice. He did not need to explain why. Some silences carry more conviction than any argument could. Frustrated, Drayton reached for the satchel himself, unzipped it, and found only duplicate documents inside, along with a small tracking device, quietly transmitting a live signal to two people neither he nor Quill had accounted for. Reese watched him paw through the papers with the detached calm of a man observing a storm from behind reinforced glass, aware that every folder Drayton flipped through told him less than he needed and more than he realized he was revealing about his own desperation. The fluorescent light buzzed on, indifferent to all of it, and somewhere down the hallway a coffee machine hissed through its cycle as though the entire building had not just tipped quietly toward catastrophe. Reese flexed his fingers inside the cuffs, feeling the metal bite a little deeper, and reminded himself that patience had never once failed him in 30 years of service, even when patience felt like the hardest possible choice available. To understand why Reese allowed himself to be handcuffed at all, the story has to move back several weeks to a routine inspection of the equipment depot that Reese had insisted on conducting personally against the advice of staff who assumed a general's time was better spent elsewhere. He found 12 armored vehicles marked ready for deployment that were, on closer inspection, missing critical armor control modules and communication units, gutted quietly enough that the paperwork attached to each vehicle still claimed full operational readiness. The maintenance logs showed the parts had supposedly been replaced by Crow Defense Group at a cost running into the millions of dollars. Yet the physical components simply were not present inside the vehicles themselves. Reese stood in that depot for a long time, running his hand along the empty compartment of the 6th vehicle, understanding that somewhere between the invoice and the inventory, someone had built a very expensive lie. Sergeant Callum Hale, 35 years old and responsible for depot inventory, approached Reese privately. 2 days later, with photographs on his personal phone showing crates being loaded onto transport trucks that carried inspection waivers signed by Colonel Quill himself. Hale had noticed the discrepancy months earlier and reported it through proper channels, only to find himself accused of losing government property and placed on administrative suspension for his trouble. Reese did not act immediately because the signatures on those transport waivers traced upward past Quill and toward a name that made even seasoned officers choose their words carefully around the base. He reached out instead to Special Agent Sienna Marlowe, a defense procurement fraud investigator he had worked alongside years earlier on an unrelated case, and the two of them began building a case in the quiet hours when the rest of the base assumed their commanding officer was simply doing paperwork. Sienna provided him with the satchel that would later sit on the passenger seat of his truck, containing duplicate copies of shipping manifests, photographs, and financial records, along with a tracking device embedded in the lining that would transmit its location the moment anyone attempted to move it outside normal channels. The original documents, the ones that actually mattered, remained locked in a secure location Sienna controlled entirely on her own, far from Fort Harrow and far from anyone who might try to make them disappear. Reese understood the risk in carrying even duplicates onto the base, but he needed to know exactly how far the corruption reached and exactly who would move first once he returned. What he had not fully anticipated was the specific, ugly shape that confrontation would take at the gate that morning, the particular cruelty Drayton would choose to wear as justification. Yet once the arrest began and its intent became unmistakable, Reese made a deliberate choice not to stop it, because letting it unfold would tell him more about the size of the conspiracy than any warrant ever could. The tracking signal from the satchel activated the instant it crossed the base perimeter, and it reached two people simultaneously. Sienna Marlowe, waiting in a vehicle less than a mile away, and Lieutenant Colonel Arya Quinn, Reese's chief of staff, who was standing in the command center at that exact moment, wondering why her commanding officer had not yet arrived for a readiness inspection scheduled for that morning. Arya checked the vehicle tracking system first out of habit rather than alarm, and found that Reese's identification had indeed been scanned successfully at the western gate before the feed simply went dark, cameras and communications dropping out within moments of each other in a pattern too clean to be coincidence. She tried his secure line 3 times without an answer, then pulled up the satchel's tracking signal, which now showed a fixed location inside the military police security station rather than moving toward the command center as expected. Arya did not send anyone to storm the building because she understood better than most the difference between rescue and procedure, and she knew that an emotional response could be twisted later into evidence of exactly the instability their commanding officer stood accused of. Instead, she initiated the command protection protocol that Fort Harrow kept on file for precisely this kind of scenario, a protocol designed for situations in which a commanding officer's location and status became compromised without explanation. 40 soldiers from the 2nd Ready Reaction Company assembled within minutes, a number chosen not for intimidation, but because it was the exact strength required under protocol to secure a perimeter of that size without leaving gaps. Their instructions were explicit and were repeated twice before they moved. Establish a security perimeter around the station, prevent any vehicle from leaving with evidence still inside, protect the server room housing camera footage from that morning, and under no circumstances point a weapon at any military police officer inside the building. They were also instructed not to enter the station itself without a lawful order authorizing them to do so, and to record every action they took using cameras entirely independent of the base's internal security network. A few junior officers voiced concern that deploying troops toward a military police station might be read as an act of internal confrontation, a mutiny dressed up in careful language. Arya answered that they were not marching against the military police. They were marching to protect a commanding officer. System itself had already confirmed, a man currently being held in violation of the very procedures meant to safeguard him. At the same time, she placed calls to the base's legal office, to the Inspector General, and to the Army Criminal Investigation Division, requesting that investigators be dispatched to the security station immediately, and that all footage from that morning be preserved under a formal evidentiary hold before anyone had the chance to delete it. As the convoy moved toward the station, word reached Colonel Quill through a nervous junior officer who had watched the soldiers assembling from a window and assumed correctly that something had gone deeply wrong with the plan. Quill's response was immediate and reckless. He ordered Drayton to erase every recording from that morning before investigators could arrive, a command spoken with the particular panic of a man who has just realized his carefully built structure is standing on sand. Drayton was still fumbling with the tracking device pulled from the satchel, trying and failing to disable its signal, when the low rumble of engines rolled through the parking lot outside the station. 40 soldiers arrived in formation, and within minutes they had encircled the building completely, positioning themselves at the vehicle gate, the rear service entrance, and the narrow hallway leading toward the server room where the morning's footage was stored. There was no shouting. There were no weapons raised toward the building or toward anyone inside it. The discipline of that silence unsettled Drayton far more than any threat could have, because threats can be argued with and discipline cannot. The soldiers moved the way people move when they have rehearsed a task so many times that thought and motion have become the same instinct. Boots striking pavement in a rhythm that felt less like aggression and more like inevitability. Fog still clung to the lower half of the parking lot, curling around ankles and tires, so that from a distance the formation seemed to rise out of the ground itself rather than arrive from anywhere in particular. A few of the younger soldiers exchanged glances as they took their positions, uncertain what exactly they were walking into, but none of them broke formation, and none of them reached for a weapon they had not been explicitly authorized to raise. Somewhere near the back of the perimeter, a soldier murmured to the man beside him that this felt less like a rescue and more like a verdict already decided, and the man beside him simply nodded and said nothing further. Arya walked to the front entrance alone and requested in a voice that carried no theatrical anger at all, immediate confirmation of the status and condition of the base's commanding officer. Drayton, emboldened by nothing more than his own fear, declared there was no general inside that building, only a dangerous individual impersonating one. Arya recited Reese's full identification code, his rank, and his command authority from memory without needing to glance at a single document, and asked Drayton to produce whatever official record had revoked that authority. Drayton had no such record because none existed. Inside the interrogation room, Reese listened to the rhythmic shift of boots outside as 40 soldiers repositioned around the building's perimeter, and something in his chest loosened slightly, though his expression did not change. Drayton, hearing the same sounds, accused Reese of summoning subordinates to intimidate a lawful security operation, twisting the moment into something it plainly was not. Reese answered that he had summoned no one, and that the very procedure Drayton was attempting to circumvent was precisely what had called those soldiers to that door. Colonel Quill, arriving moments later with his uniform slightly askew from having dressed too quickly, ordered the station sealed and declared a security threat in progress, a claim built entirely on nothing. Arya informed him calmly and without flinching that an evidentiary preservation order was already in effect, and that any attempt to delete camera footage from that point forward would be documented as active obstruction of a federal investigation. Almost immediately after her warning, the station's internal server flagged an attempt to erase files originating from an account registered to Colonel Quill himself, a digital fingerprint that would prove far harder to explain away than any spoken denial. Quill arrived at the station accompanied by Brigadier General Sterling Crow, who stepped out of his vehicle in a uniform so immaculate it seemed designed for cameras that were not yet there, projecting the calm of a man who believed he could still talk his way through anything. Crow announced in a voice pitched for an audience that he intended to resolve what he called an unfortunate misunderstanding, and he instructed the 40 soldiers to return immediately to their barracks. Arya refused, explaining that his order directly conflicted with an active command protection protocol and an evidentiary preservation directive already in force. Crow's calm slipped just slightly as he threatened her with insubordination charges, a threat that landed with considerably less weight than he seemed to expect. At that exact moment, Special Agent Sienna Marlowe arrived on foot from her vehicle, carrying a search warrant issued through military judicial channels less than an hour earlier. Crow attempted to block her path, insisting this was strictly an internal matter for the base to handle on its own without outside interference. Sienna told him plainly that the theft of tens of millions of dollars in defense equipment had stopped being an internal matter the moment it began, and she walked past him into the building without waiting for permission that was never going to come. Drayton, cornered and out of options, was ordered to bring Reese out of the interrogation room, his wrists still bound, his rank insignia sitting confiscated on a nearby table, a visible bruise forming along one forearm from where the cuffs had been tightened past necessity. When Reese crossed the threshold into the parking lot, still restrained, still without his stars, 40 soldiers came to attention as one. The sound of boots striking pavement rolled across the lot like a single held breath finally released. Arya's voice cut through the morning air, clear and unwavering. "Commanding officer present." Every soldier in that perimeter raised a salute, and the sight of it landed on Drayton like a physical blow, the full weight of what he had done arriving all at once, undeniable and irreversible. The man he had called an imposter, the man he had mocked at the gate less than 2 hours earlier, was the very officer every soldier surrounding that building had been sworn to serve and protect. For a long moment, nobody in that parking lot moved, the salute holding in the cold morning air while the fog thinned around them, and Reese let the silence stretch before he finally lifted his own bound hands in acknowledgement, a gesture that carried more command than any shouted order could have managed. Drayton stood frozen near the doorway, his earlier certainty draining visibly from his face, replaced by the particular stillness of a man watching the ground shift beneath everything he thought he understood. Reese did not ask for the handcuffs to be removed right away. He asked instead a single question directed at Drayton. Who signed the order authorizing this arrest? Drayton's hand rose, trembling slightly, and pointed toward Quill, who immediately protested that Drayton had simply misunderstood his instructions, a denial so transparent that even the soldiers standing nearest exchanged quiet glances. Reese turned to Sienna and told her without a trace of anger in his voice not to remove the cuffs until the fabricated report was read aloud in front of everyone present. Sienna retrieved the incident report Drayton had filed less than an hour earlier and read it in full, her voice flat and precise, allowing the document's own dishonesty to speak for itself. According to Drayton's written account, Reese had arrived without valid identification, had attempted to force his way through the checkpoint, had behaved in a threatening manner, and had physically resisted arrest before finally identifying himself with an unverifiable claim of rank. Arya presented the base's own access logs, which showed Reese's identification had been confirmed successfully on the very first scan, contradicting Drayton's claim within seconds. Dashboard camera footage from the truck, recovered before anyone had the chance to erase it, showed Reese stopping precisely where instructed and stepping out of the vehicle without resistance of any kind. A biometric readout from his service watch submitted as supplementary evidence showed a steady, unremarkable heart rate throughout the entire encounter, directly contradicting Drayton's description of an agitated, combative man. Owen Hale, the young officer who had hesitated at the gate, admitted under Sienna's questioning that Drayton had explicitly ordered every camera disabled the moment he recognized Reese's face, an admission that visibly deflated whatever confidence Drayton had left. Drayton turned toward Quill and insisted he had only followed direct instructions to secure the satchel at any cost, his voice cracking with the particular panic of a man realizing he is about to be left alone to answer for everything. Quill denied any involvement whatsoever, his denial delivered with the smooth, practiced tone of someone who had rehearsed it long before this morning ever arrived. Sienna responded by playing a recorded phone call obtained through a lawful wiretap authorized weeks earlier, in which Quill's own voice could be heard giving an unambiguous instruction: "Do not let Calder leave that station with those documents." Crow tried to interject, claiming Quill had acted entirely on his own initiative without any knowledge or approval from above him. Reese asked Sienna to check the timestamp on a separate document, one that proposed Reese's temporary removal from command, and the answer that came back changed the entire shape of the room. That document had been created 3 hours before the arrest at the gate had even taken place, and it described with unsettling precision an incident that had not yet happened. General Calder, discovered at the Western checkpoint, exhibiting unstable behavior requiring restraint by military police. The arrest had not been a reaction to anything Reese had done. It had been written first and then performed exactly as scripted. Once the final page of that same document stated plainly that Brigadier General Sterling Crow would assume command of Fort Harrow immediately following Reese's removal, a detail that stripped away any remaining pretense of coincidence or overreaction. Crow insisted the document was nothing more than a contingency plan prepared in case of an unrelated emergency, and that its timing meant nothing at all. Reese asked him quietly how a contingency plan could describe the precise gate, the precise hour, and the precise accusations that would later be used against him if it had truly been written for some unrelated scenario. Unable to answer, Crow shifted immediately into a different kind of attack, one aimed not at the evidence, but at Reese's character. He claimed that Reese had sown division throughout the base, had cast suspicion on families with generations of honorable service behind them, and had turned a routine inventory audit into what he called a personal crusade against people who had done nothing wrong. Reese answered without raising his voice, though something in his tone had hardened into something closer to steel. He said the issue was never the Crow name or the Rothwell name, families whose service records he respected, regardless of what their current members had chosen to do with that inheritance. The issue was missing components, stripped from combat vehicles, and falsified readiness reports capable of getting soldiers killed on a deployment where those vehicles would fail exactly when they were needed most. Sienna presented financial records tracing payments from Crow Defense Group directly to a private consulting fund managed by Crow's own brother, each payment landing within days of a specific shipment, leaving the base under a waiver Quill had personally signed. Sergeant Callum Hale was located minutes later in a holding room at the rear of the station, where he had been confined overnight on a fabricated charge of losing government property. He confirmed in a steady voice that carried no hesitation, despite everything he had endured, that Crow had personally instructed him months earlier to alter the serial numbers on replacement components before installation. When Hale refused, he said, they began quietly preparing to blame the entire pattern of missing equipment on him instead. A convenient scapegoat with no rank and no resources to fight back. Drayton, listening to Hale's account, seemed to finally understand that he, too, had been chosen for exactly the same purpose. A disposable name meant to absorb the consequences if the plan ever collapsed. He began speaking without waiting for further questions, describing a private meeting between Quill, Crow, and a representative from Crow Defense Group that had taken place weeks earlier in a location far from any official record. Sienna's phone buzzed with a message from her field office, and she read it aloud to the room. Evelyn Crow, chairwoman of Crow Defense Group, had been intercepted at an airport while attempting to board a private flight out of the country. With the fabricated report thoroughly dismantled and every relevant piece of physical evidence formally logged and preserved, Sienna finally stepped forward and unlocked the handcuffs from Reese's wrists with her own hands. Deep red marks remained visible where the metal had bitten into his skin for far longer than it should have. But Reese did not look at Drayton the way a man looks at someone he intends to punish out of spite. His first order, once his hands were free, was not to arrest every military police officer standing in that parking lot, a distinction that surprised more than a few of the soldiers watching him. He instructed his staff instead to separate everyone present into 4 distinct categories: those who had knowingly participated in the conspiracy from its earliest stages, those who had merely followed orders out of genuine fear for their own careers, those who had quietly tried to preserve evidence despite the pressure surrounding them, and those who would need protection in order to testify safely later. Drayton and Quill were taken into custody for formal investigation into unlawful detention, falsification of official records, and obstruction of a federal inquiry, their careers effectively ending in that parking lot even before formal charges were filed. Crow was relieved of his command authority on the spot, his access credentials revoked immediately, and he was handed over to investigators for further questioning under considerably less favorable circumstances than the ones he had clearly expected to control. Owen Hale, the young officer who had refused to disable his final camera despite Drayton's explicit threat, was placed under formal protection against any retaliation for that single act of quiet integrity. Callum Hale was released from the holding room, his access to legal counsel restored immediately, and the fabricated charge against him formally dismissed before the sun had even fully risen over the base. Reese turned to face the 40 soldiers still holding their perimeter around the station and thanked them specifically for maintaining discipline throughout an event that could easily have spiraled into something violent and irreversible. He told them their loyalty had never needed to become force, and that the fact it never did was the real victory of that entire morning, more meaningful than any arrest made inside the building behind them. Drayton, still shaken and searching for some way to soften what he had done, insisted one final time that he had simply mistaken Reese for an imposter, an honest error made in the dark before dawn. Reese studied him for a long moment before answering, his voice quiet but carrying easily across the silent lot. "You did not mistake my rank," he said. "You saw it clearly. What you refused to believe was that a man with a face like mine had any right to wear it." Before Crow was led away toward a waiting vehicle, he turned back one final time and warned Reese that the Crow family carried enough influence to make this entire investigation quietly disappear within the week. The investigation, however, did not stay contained within the boundaries of Fort Harrow for long. Records seized during the search revealed that Crow Defense Group had been purchasing stolen military components for months, altering their serial numbers and reselling them back to multiple bases across the country at inflated prices that had already cost taxpayers tens of millions of dollars. Evelyn Crow, once she was formally detained and questioned, attempted to portray herself as an unwitting victim of a handful of dishonest officers acting entirely without her knowledge or approval. That defense collapsed almost immediately once investigators produced a series of emails bearing her own digital signature, emails that made unmistakably clear she had understood precisely where those components had originally come from. Crow, sensing the walls closing in around him from every direction, offered to testify against Quill in exchange for a reduced sentence, hoping to salvage something from the wreckage of his career. Quill in turn surrendered a collection of recorded conversations, proving that Crow had been the true architect behind the entire operation from its very beginning, not merely a willing participant swept along by someone else's ambition. Drayton admitted in a formal statement, given without further resistance, that he had been promised an accelerated promotion in exchange for portraying Reese as an unstable and dangerous commanding officer and seizing his documents before they could reach investigators. The falsified reports that had circulated quietly through the base for months were formally revoked and struck from every official record they had ever touched. Officers who had been quietly transferred out of Fort Harrow months earlier, simply for raising concerns that nobody wanted to hear at the time, were invited back to provide testimony that finally carried the institutional weight it had always deserved. Reese made a deliberate choice not to allow the unfolding story to become a public spectacle celebrating his own vindication, a performance of power meant for cameras and headlines. He insisted in every interview and every internal briefing that followed that the situation had not been resolved because 40 soldiers outnumbered the handful of people inside that station. It had been resolved because those 40 soldiers, and the procedures guiding every one of their actions that morning, had respected the law far more consistently than the people who had spent months quietly abusing it for their own benefit. Months later, Reese drove back through the same western gate at almost exactly the same hour the original arrest had taken place, the fog once again low and pale across the asphalt in a way that felt to him almost deliberately symbolic. The security systems throughout Fort Harrow had been rebuilt from the ground up in the months following the investigation, closing every gap that had once allowed a handful of officers to operate entirely outside meaningful oversight. No security officer retained the unilateral ability to disable a body camera or redirect evidence away from its proper chain of custody without triggering an immediate and automatic review. Every waiver permitting a vehicle to bypass standard inspection now required a second, fully independent confirmation before it could be approved and executed. Reports filed by junior enlisted personnel concerning the conduct of senior officers were routed directly to the Inspector General's office whenever they touched on anything involving command-level authority, bypassing the very chain that had once allowed complaints to quietly vanish. Callum Hale returned to his position at the equipment depot and was formally commended for the courage and consistency with which he had protected the safety and integrity of his unit under considerable personal pressure. Aria Quinn remained Chief of Staff. Her judgment that morning, cited repeatedly in the base's newly revised protocols as a model for how command protection procedures were meant to function under genuine pressure. The 40 soldiers who had encircled the station that day did not receive medals framed around the idea of rescuing their general from danger, a narrative that would have missed the point entirely. Instead, they were formally recognized for maintaining absolute discipline in a situation that could very easily have collapsed into chaos, choosing procedure and restraint over anger, even when anger would have been the far easier and more human response. In the story's final quiet moment, Reese guided his old pickup truck through the western gate once more, the engine humming low beneath him in the early morning stillness. A new military police officer, one who had not yet been assigned to Fort Harrow during the events of that difficult morning, checked his identification through the proper procedure now firmly in place, recognized the name almost immediately, and straightened into a crisp, unhesitating salute. Reese returned the salute with the same steadiness he carried through every version of that gate, whether he was walking through it freely or being dragged toward it in restraints. He did not ask for special treatment because of the stars now resting securely on his shoulder once again. He asked only that everyone who passed through that checkpoint, regardless of rank or appearance or the assumptions a stranger might carry about them, be judged by evidence and by procedure, not by the color of their skin or the authority a suspicious officer imagined they did or did not possess. Before leaving the station that final time, Reese paused briefly in the doorway of the very room where he had once sat in handcuffs, studying the space in silence for a moment longer than necessary. The people who had believed they could strip away his authority with a single fabricated report were gone now, their names attached permanently to charges instead of command assignments. What mattered far more than their absence, though, was the fact that the very system which had once shielded and enabled them had finally been dismantled as well, piece by piece, until nothing remained of the quiet machinery that had let them operate unchecked for so long. 40 soldiers had not surrounded that station to prove how powerful one general could be when pushed into a corner. They had stood there silent and disciplined to prove that even the most powerful man on that base still had to be protected by law rather than by vengeance, and that no uniform, no rank, and no family name would ever again be permitted to stand above the simple, uncompromising truth of the evidence itself.